Late November, 1843. The high valley in the northern Rocky Mountains was already deep in winter's grip, a desolate expanse of gray rock and wind-scoured pine. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp metallic ring of an axe and the pressurized hiss of wind sluicing through the high peaks. Elias Thorne was returning to his cabin, his moccasins crunching through the thin crust of snow that had fallen before dawn. He was 40, but the high-altitude cold had etched deeper lines into his face, making him look a decade older. He was a trapper, and this was his third winter in this territory, his first in this specific high canyon line. He'd spent the last 4 hours checking a short trap line along a creek that refused to freeze solid, and a misstep on a slick, ice-sheathed rock had sent him plunging thigh-deep into the rushing black water. The cold was so profound, so immediate, that it hadn't felt wet. It simply felt like his leg had been encased in burning iron. He had scrambled out, his wool trousers and long coat instantly stiffening, the water freezing in the weave before it could even drip. Now, approaching his small, notched log cabin, he felt the familiar, creeping dread. It was not the dread of the cold outside. That was a known quantity, an honest adversary. It was the dread of the shelter itself. He pushed open the heavy, ill-fitting plank door. A puff of smoke and condensation billowed out to greet him, mingling with the biting wind. Inside, the cabin was a portrait of misery. He had left a small fire smoldering in the crude box stove, but its heat was pathetic. The stove, made of thin sheet iron and hauled in on a mule, radiated an aggressive, scorching heat for 3 feet in every direction, but did nothing for the rest of the 16 by 12 space. The cabin was the cold. Frost, thick and crystalline, coated the inside of the log walls. It wasn't just near the door, it was everywhere, a glittering internal rime that sparkled in the dim light from the single greased parchment window. His breath plumed in front of his face, identical to the air outside, only heavier, staler. The floor, made of rough-hewn puncheons laid directly over the frozen earth, was so cold it felt sticky. Elias moved stiffly, his frozen trousers rattling like wood. He fed aspen rounds into the stove, and the iron ticked and pinged as the fire caught. He hung his frozen mackinaw and trousers from a willow branch he'd strung across the cabin, near the stovepipe. For a moment, they steamed. The ice melted, dripped onto the floor, and instantly refroze in small, dark puddles. But the steam did not vanish. It rose, hit the frigid roof poles, and condensed, freezing into a new layer of hoarfrost on the ceiling. The clothes did not dry. They merely transitioned from ice-stiff to damp-stiff. He knew from experience they would hang there for 3 days, slowly freeze-drying, and every ounce of water they released would join the suffocating, frigid dampness of the cabin. He sat on his low stool, peeling off his soaked moccasins, his feet already numb and white. He was living in a trap of his own making. This was the fundamental lethal problem of the high-altitude winter. Not the cold, but the damp. A man could freeze to death next, to a roaring fire, killed by the moisture of his own breath and the sweat of his own labor, captured and held against him by a shelter that refused to breathe. He looked at the frost on the walls, just 6 feet from the glowing stove, and knew something was profoundly, structurally wrong with the common wisdom. This cabin, built just as he'd been taught, wasn't a shelter. It was a cold box, an ice-lined tomb that was slowly, methodically sealing him in with his own misery. He had built the cabin that same summer, following the exact methods he'd learned from other trappers back east, in the softer, wetter woods of the Alleghenies. The wisdom was simple: build heavy, build tight. He'd chosen a stand of lodgepole pine, felling trees until his hands were raw blisters. He'd saddle-notched the corners just as he'd been shown, stacking the 10-inch logs one by one. The work was brutal, solitary. He had spent weeks peeling the bark, dragging the logs into place with his mule, and wrestling them up. The structure was strong. It would shed snow and, he believed, blunt the wind. For chinking, he had done what everyone did. He'd pounded dry moss and wood splinters into the larger gaps, then sealed the whole thing with a thick daubing of clay mud mixed with grass. It looked tight. It looked permanent. He'd laid a floor of split logs, or puncheons, setting them on 2 sleeper logs laid directly on the leveled earth. The roof was a shallow pitch, built of heavy poles, covered in pine boughs, and then topped with 6 inches of sod and clay he'd dug from the creek bank. Finally, the stove. It was a simple rectangular firebox of thin sheet iron, with a door, a crude damper, and a 6-inch pipe that went straight up, exiting through a clay and metal collar in the roof. It was, by all accounts, a perfect, standard frontier cabin, and it began to fail almost immediately. The first sign had been the floor. As autumn nights deepened, the ground beneath the cabin froze solid, and that cold leached straight up through the puncheons. The floor became a slab of ice. No matter how hot he ran the stove, the cold radiated upwards, chilling his feet and legs, forcing him to keep his boots on until he climbed into his elevated bunk. Then the drafts started. The wind in this high valley didn't blow. It pressed. It was a constant heavy force that found every single flaw in his mud chinking. The clay, frozen solid, had shrunk and cracked. Microscopic fissures opened up everywhere. Wind drove through them, not as a breeze, but as tiny needle-like jets of sub-zero air. He would wake in the night to find a small drift of powder snow on his blankets, blown through a crack in the wall just inches from his face. But the damp was the worst. The cabin was too tight and too cold at the same time. The stove was an inefficient monster. It devoured wood, turning the area around it into a scorching desert, while the corners of the room remained below freezing. When he boiled water for coffee, or cooked a stew, the steam would rise, hit the cold-soaked roof, and condense. It didn't just drip, it rained cold water back down on him. Or, as the temperature plummeted, it would simply freeze, coating the ceiling in a layer of icy fur. He was trapped in a cycle. To stay warm, he had to burn wood constantly. To get wood, he had to work outside. When he worked, he sweat. When he came inside, his damp clothes released that moisture, which hit the walls and froze. The cabin was actively sucking the heat and life out of him. He tried to solve it the standard way. He chinked again, using precious daylight to mix mud with his gloved hands, plastering it over the cracks, only to see it freeze and flake off. He tried hanging a heavy buffalo hide over the door, which only seemed to redirect the drafts to the window. He was exhausted, frustrated, and consumed by a single terrifying thought. Why is this not working? This is how everyone does it. He realized, sitting there with numb feet, that the standard method was designed for a different world. A world with milder winters, less wind, and perhaps more forgiving materials. Here, at 9,000 feet, the rules were different. The common wisdom was a lie, and it was going to kill him. The turning point came not from a person, but from a ruin. In a rare break in the weather, Elias had pushed farther up the valley than he'd ever gone, tracking a wolverine that had been poaching his traps. The trail led him to a small sheltered bowl in the mountainside, and there, nearly invisible against the snow, was the skeletal remnant of a shelter. It was not a cabin. It was a low-slung structure half dug into the hillside, its front wall made of thick, stacked stone. It had clearly been abandoned for years, but what caught his eye was the chimney. It wasn't a stovepipe. It was a massive, battered chimney of stone and clay, positioned not at the end of the hut, but near the center. He stepped inside the roofless ruin. The wind outside was shrieking, but inside the stone-walled depression, the air was almost perfectly still. He saw that the firebox was huge, deep, and lined with soapstone that was still smooth, though blackened by ancient fires. But the most curious part was behind the chimney. A second, smaller flue seemed to rise from the ground, lined with stones, opening near the base of the firebox. It looked like an air intake. He knelt, clearing snow. It was a small tunnel, maybe 8 inches square, that ran under the floor and opened to the outside, aimed at the prevailing wind. He stared at it for a long time, the cold biting his cheeks. This wasn't a chimney, it was part of a system. The builder, whoever he was, perhaps an old forgotten prospector, or a Basque shepherd, hadn't just built a fireplace, he'd built an engine. This design inhaled the wind, fed it directly to the fire, and used the fire's draft to pull that air through the structure. It was the opposite of his cabin, which fought the wind and lost. This shelter used the wind. The memory of that ruin stayed with him. A week later, he was forced to travel to the nearest trading post, 2 days' ride down canyon, to trade his meager bundle of pelts for flour and shot. The post was run by a man named Henri Le Corbeau Dubois, a French-Canadian voyageur who had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company for 30 years before settling. He was a small, wiry man with eyes that had seen too much ice. Elias found him in the trading room, smoking his pipe next to a massive, peculiar stove. It was a barrel stove, but a complex one. It looked like 2 oil drums welded together, one sitting on top of the other, with a maze of pipes connecting them. The room was not just warm, it was dry and comfortable. Elias, his clothes still damp from the ride, could feel the difference instantly. He commented on the heat. Henri chuckled, tapping his pipe on the stove. "She is not a stove, mon ami. She is a brûleur, a burner. She burns the smoke." He explained in his clipped, heavily accented English the principle. The fire in the bottom drum was hot, but the smoke, the unburnt gas, was routed into the second drum, where it got hot enough to ignite again. "You Americans," he said, gesturing with his pipe, "you build a fire, and you let all the heat escape up the pipe. You are warming the clouds. The heat is in the smoke. You must burn the smoke." He pointed to the stovepipe. It was barely warm to the touch, even though the stove itself was radiating immense, steady heat. All the energy was being extracted inside the room. Then Henri pointed to a small, screened hole in the wall behind the stove. "And she must breathe," he said. "A fire, she is like a man. She must have air. You give her her own air from outside. Then she does not steal your air. She does not steal your heat. She makes a draft, pulls the damp out." Elias stood there stunned. The ruin on the mountain, the double-barrel stove, the dedicated air intake, it all clicked into place. He wasn't just building a box, he was managing a system of pressures. He wasn't just making heat, he was moving air. He bought his flour, but he also spent his last remaining credit on a small sheet of tin and a bag of rock salt. He had a plan. He would not just modify his cabin, he would rebuild its very lungs. Elias returned to his cabin with the methodical focus of a man possessed. The journey back was a torment, not from the cold, but from the obsessive planning that consumed his mind. He spent the first night back not sleeping, but sitting on his stool, staring at his pathetic, inefficient stove, sketching on the floor with a piece of charred wood. He was no longer a trapper, he was an engineer. He listed the failures, one by one, on a piece of discarded packing slate. Failure 1. The floor. It was a slab of ice, sucking heat from his body. Failure 2. The walls. They were cold-soaked, condensing every drop of moisture, acting as a thermal bridge to the outside. Failure 3. The stove. It was an air sucker, creating negative pressure, pulling drafts through every crack. Failure 4. The air. It was static. Hot air rose to the ceiling and stayed there while cold, damp air pooled on the floor. There was no circulation. His plan would be a war waged on 4 fronts, and it had to be done in the heart of winter, a feat most would call suicidal. First, the floor. He couldn't rip it out, not now. But he could isolate himself from it, He would use his remaining split logs to build a raised platform, an interior island for his bunk and stool, getting his body 2 feet off the frozen puncheons. Second, the walls. He couldn't rebuild them, but he could insulate them. He would spend days harvesting dry, standing grasses and reeds from the frozen marsh, stuffing them into every internal crack. Then, he would use his precious canvas tarp, his only one, and nail it to the inside of the wall he slept against, creating an air gap. This inner wall would, he hoped, stay warmer than the logs, preventing condensation right where he slept. Third, and most critically, the stove and the air. This was the masterstroke, inspired by Henri and the ruin. He would dismantle his entire stovepipe. He would use the new tin sheet and the metal salvaged from old bean cans to create a horizontal radiator. The pipe would no longer go straight up. It would exit the stove, make a 90-degree turn, run 6 feet across the cabin, just below the ceiling, and then make another turn to exit through the roof. This would force the hot smoke to travel, releasing its heat into the room for far longer. He would wrap this horizontal pipe in a cage of wire, and on this wire he would mix a paste of the river clay and the rock salt he'd bought. The salt would lower the freezing point of the clay, letting it cure, while the clay itself would turn the pipe into a thermal mass, radiating gentle, even heat long after the fire died down. And to feed it, he would build the breather. He would drill a 2-inch hole through the floor directly behind the stove and run a simple wooden box snorkel under the cabin wall to the outside air. The stove would now drink the outside cold, not his warm inside air. Finally, the trick itself, the ventilation. He realized that drying his clothes was not about heat, it was about airflow. He needed to get the damp air out. He would cut a new, small 4-inch square hole in the gable wall, high up, on the end of the cabin, opposite the stove. He would fashion a simple, sliding wooden cover for it. This was his exhaust. His new cabin would operate like a living creature. Cold, fresh air would be inhaled by the stove. The stove would exhale hot, dry gas through the long, radiating pipe. This heat would rise, creating a slow, continuous convection loop across the ceiling. This loop would pass over his drying rack, which he would move to be directly under the horizontal pipe, and then, carrying all the steam from his clothes, it would be drawn out the small, high vent. He spent a full day just gathering the materials, his hands aching, his lungs burning. He knew he would have only one chance to do this. When he took the stove apart, the cabin would become lethally cold within an hour. He had to work fast, and he could not make a mistake. The next morning, under a sky the color of lead, he opened his cabin door, let the meager fire die to embers, and began to dismantle his only source of life. The labor was a special kind of hell. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted instantly. Within minutes, Elias was working in the same biting cold as the outside, but without the benefit of movement. His breath plumed, and the sweat from his exertion froze on his eyebrows. His fingers, even in his mitts, quickly became numb, useless claws. He had to stop every 10 minutes to beat his hands against his legs, the pain of their rewarming in agony. He started with the stovepipe. Disconnecting the sections was a battle. They were sealed with frozen creosote. He used his hatchet to chisel them apart, the metallic clangs echoing painfully in the small space. He laid the pieces out, his plan clear in his mind. He cut the new tin sheet with his shears, the snip, snip, snip sounding brittle in the frozen air. He formed the new horizontal drum, riveting it with cold iron rivets, his hammer blows clumsy. His hands were bleeding inside his mitts, the small cuts instantly numbed. He wrestled the new assembly into place, bracing it with wire slung over a roof pole. He could feel the clock ticking. The internal rime on the walls seemed to be growing thicker, creeping across the logs as the cabin's last vestige of warmth was sucked away. He mixed the clay and salt with snow, his hands plunged into the gritty, freezing slurry. He plastered it over the new horizontal pipe, his fingers burning as if dipped in acid. The mud froze almost as he applied it, but he hoped the salt would allow it to cure, rather than just fracture, when the heat finally came. Next, the breather. He lay on the frozen floor, the cold searing through his back, and painstakingly drilled a series layout of holes with his auger, connecting them with his chisel, to create the opening behind the stove. He slid the prefabricated wooden snorkel through it, packing the edges with moss. Then he turned to the high vent, climbing on his stool, his head brushing the frosted ceiling. He sawed the small square hole in the gable, the dry wood screaming. He affixed the small sliding plank. It was done. The system was built. The cabin was now a disaster zone. Tools scattered, scraps of metal on the floor, muddy, icy handprints on the walls. And it was colder inside than it was out. He was shivering violently, his core temperature dropping. This was the moment of truth. With fumbling wooden fingers, he stuffed dry kindling into the stove. He struck his flint and steel, but his hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to catch a spark in his charcloth. The kindling caught. He added larger splits. He closed the stove door and opened the stove's small intake damper. He heard it immediately. A low, soft whoosh. It was the sound of the stove inhaling through the new, dedicated breather. It was a clean, steady, perfect draft. The fire didn't just smolder. It ignited, roaring to life with a clean, hot flame. He watched, holding his breath. The stove body began to tick and ping. The new horizontal pipe, coated in its frozen clay armor, began to steam. The cabin filled with a strange, earthy, salty smell as the clay cured. The heat that came off it was not the scorching, thin heat of before. It was a deep, penetrating, radiant heat. It filled the entire room, not just the space around the stove. He looked at the floor. He looked at the walls. He waited. The test wasn't just heat. It was humidity. The true trial was coming. That night the sky opened. A blizzard born in the Arctic and funneled down the spine of the continent slammed into the valley. It was not a storm. It was a siege. The wind screamed, a solid wall of sound that made the logs of the cabin groan and shudder. The temperature, Elias knew, was dropping to 40 below zero, a cold that could freeze a man's spit before it hit the ground. This was the test. This was the moment that would validate his work or sign his death warrant. Before the storm hit its peak, he'd had to make a final desperate run to his woodpile, 50 yards from the cabin. He was soaked, not by rain, but by the flying, granular snow that was as wet as water and as sharp as sand. He burst back into the cabin, caked in white, his mackinaw and wool pants already freezing into solid armor. This was the exact scenario that had plagued him for months. In his old cabin, he would have been faced with a grim choice: sleep in wet clothes and risk freezing to death in his bunk, or strip and shiver violently, waiting 3 days for the clothes to dry while the cabin filled with ice. Now, he executed his plan. He stoked the stove until it was humming, the horizontal clay-covered pipe radiating a powerful, steady warmth that felt like desert sun. He stripped off his frozen gear. He hung the stiff-as-board pants, shirt, and mackinaw on the willow drying rack he had rehung directly beneath. The new horizontal radiator pipe. He hoisted the rack up high until the clothes were just a foot below the hot, clay-caked drum. Then he walked to the far wall and opened the small, high vent, sliding the wooden panel back just 1 inch. The effect was immediate. The cabin, which had been perfectly, almost uncomfortably warm, suddenly breathed. He could feel the air move. It was not a draft. It was a slow, massive, imperceptible current. The hot, dry air rising from the stove and radiator was pulled upward, passed through the frozen, steaming clothes, absorbed their moisture, and was then drawn, like a river, across the ceiling to the small exhaust vent on the far side. He watched, mesmerized. Steam poured off the clothes in clouds, but it did not rise to the ceiling and freeze. It was captured by the airflow and pulled sideways, straight toward the vent, where it disappeared. He placed his hand near the vent and felt a gentle, steady flow of damp, warm air being pushed out of the cabin. He went to the walls. He wiped his hand on the logs where the frost had been thickest. They were cold, but they were bone dry. He checked the parchment window. No condensation, no ice. The cabin had found its equilibrium. It was inhaling cold, dry air, processing it into hot, dry air, using that air to suck the moisture from his clothes, and then exhaling the dampness back into the storm where it belonged. He sat on his raised bunk in the dry, enveloping warmth and listened to the blizzard try to tear the world apart. He felt an almost giddy sense of relief. He cooked a meal, and the steam from his pot was whisked away. He fell asleep for the first time in months in a cabin that felt like a home, not a tomb. When he awoke 8 hours later, the storm was still raging, but the cabin was quiet, warm, and dry. He lowered the drying rack. He touched the heavy wool mackinaw. It was not just dry. It was hot, as if it had been sitting in front of a fireplace. He put it on, the warmth sinking into his skin. He had done it. He had created a living, breathing machine that could turn the deadliest blizzard into a minor inconvenience. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. When it finally broke, the world was silent, white and buried. Elias emerged from his cabin into a landscape transformed. The snow drifted higher than his roofline. He was digging a path to his woodpile when he saw a figure, a black speck moving slowly against the blinding white. It was his nearest neighbor, Silas Vane, a young trapper from Ohio whose cabin was 3 miles down canyon. Vane was stumbling, half frozen, his face a mask of ice and frostbite. He had seen Elias's stovepipe smoke and was making a desperate last-ditch effort to reach him. Elias dragged him inside. Vane's cabin, built the standard way, had become his coffin. The wind had driven snow through every crack. His fire had died, and the internal frost had coated everything, leaving his blankets and all his spare clothes a solid block of ice. He was in the first stages of hypothermia. Elias sat him by the stove, stripped him of his frozen clothes, and wrapped him in dry blankets. Silas Vane just stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. It's warm, Thorn," he stammered, his teeth chattering. "But it's dry. My God, it's dry. How?" Elias, while heating broth, explained the system. He pointed to the breather pipe. He pointed to the long horizontal radiator. And he pointed to the small sliding vent in the gable. "It has to breathe, Silas," Elias said, handing him the cup. "You're fighting the wind. I'm using it. It breathes in, and it breathes out, and it takes the damp with it." Silas stayed for 2 days. He watched Elias hang his own soaked garments and see them dry in hours. He studied the stove, the joints, the draft. When he left, he was a convert. He returned to his cabin, not just to survive, but to rebuild it. The idea spread, as all good ideas do on the frontier, through desperation and proof. The Thorn system, as some called it, or the dry cabin, became the new standard in that high valley. When a new family of settlers arrived the following spring, planning to build on the valley floor, Silas Vane and Elias Thorn were there to meet them. They didn't just help them raise the logs. They showed them how to build the breather, how to orient the cabin to the wind, and how to run the stovepipe across the ceiling before it went out. They taught them to burn the smoke. Within a decade, the cabins in that region were visibly different. They were more efficient, burning 1/3 of the wood. They were healthier. The dreaded lung fever that claimed so many in damp, drafty shelters became a rarity. The design was adapted. Some used 2 stoves, one for cooking and one for heat. Others, building with stone, created massive, baffled chimneys that held heat for days. But the principle remained: control the air, exhaust the damp, and burn the fuel completely. The legacy was not one of invention, but of adaptation. It was the fusion of an old voyager's wisdom, the ghost of a ruin on a mountainside, and the desperate innovation of a man pushed to his absolute limit. What Elias Thorne had constructed, without a blueprint or a single word of high-concept physics, was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. He had intuitively grasped the three fundamental pillars of high efficiency: cold climate survival. The first was controlled combustion. By giving the stove its own dedicated external air intake, he had decoupled the fire from the cabin's atmosphere. His stove no longer created negative pressure. It didn't suck cold air in through every crack. This single change stopped the drafts and allowed the cabin to retain the heat it generated. The fire burned hotter, cleaner, and more efficiently because its air supply was steady and predictable. The second principle was maximal heat extraction. The standard stovepipe, going straight up, was a chimney for heat. It was an escape route. By routing the pipe horizontally, wrapping it in clay and salt, Elias had built a crude but brilliant heat exchanger. The hot exhaust gases, which in any other cabin would have been wasted on the winter sky, were forced to travel 10 feet inside the living space. They gave up their thermal energy to the clay mass, which in turn radiated that heat gently and evenly throughout the room. He wasn't just heating with fire, he was heating with the smoke. He had, as Henri Dubois advised, burned the smoke. The final, and most crucial, principle was ventilation and moisture management. Elias had recognized that the enemy was not the cold, it was the water. His cabin was a sealed jar, trapping the moisture from his breath, his cooking, and his drying clothes. The small, high-up exhaust vent on the opposite wall was the master stroke. It worked with the stove to create a convection loop. Hot, dry air from the radiator rose. It moved across the ceiling, pulling moisture from the air, and was then systematically exhausted from the cabin. He had created a system that actively dehumidified the air, preventing condensation and keeping the interior, his insulation, and his clothes permanently dry. This combination, a sealed combustion system, a heat exchanger, and active ventilation, is the very definition of a modern, high-performance, resilient home. He hadn't just built a better stove. He had built a system where the stove, the shelter, and the air itself worked as one. Elias Thorne lived in that valley for another 20 years. He saw settlers come and go. He watched the frontier change, and he saw his dry cabin principles become so common that no one remembered where they started. They simply became the way things were done. He died an old man, not in the grip of a blizzard, but in his bunk, in the warm, dry cabin he had built, the air still moving in its slow, gentle loop. The cabin itself stood for another half-century, a testament to a sound idea, long after the man who built it was gone. The lesson of his design transcended the simple act of drying clothes. It was a philosophical statement, written in logs, clay, and iron. It proved that survival is not a matter of force, but of understanding. The frontier did not reward those who fought the elements. It rewarded those who observed them, who saw the invisible currents of physics that governed their world. Elias Thorne's true genius was not in building a wall, but in building a current. He learned that a shelter must not be a sealed box, but a living thing. It must breathe, just as its occupant breathes. He had discovered that the most profound innovations are often not additions, but openings. The difference between a frozen tomb and a comfortable home was a single 4-inch hole that let the steam out. He had proven that the greatest tool a person can possess against disaster is not strength, but the willingness to see why the old ways are failing, and the courage to engineer a new one.